Thank you very much. So yeah, filling in at the last minute, let's go. So improving your tool UX design by removing the faults of sensible defaults. First, a little bit about who am I? Who's this guy talking in front of you? So I'm Robin-Yann Storm. I used to work on indie studios, on games for console and PC. I was then a co-founder of an indie studio for a little bit of time. And I went into freelancing and consulting as a tool designer. Then I went into the AAA industry, working as a tool designer at IO Interactive on the Glacier 2 engine, on which the Hitman games are built. And then I worked at Guerrilla Games for a little bit, working on the Decima engine, on which the Horizon games are built. And then I became a tool designer at Apple for a few years, working on the Vision Pro 3D toolset. And now I am back to being a workflow consultant and freelance tool designer. So, defaults of sensible defaults. What does that mean? Well, this is more about tool UX and UI than it is about engineering, but it's important to keep in mind when you are doing that engineering. And it's about the well-being of your users, both internally and externally. And it's about the quality and speed of your tools. Let's go through a couple of examples. Here's Unity, right? And we have a couple of sections in Unity. These sections. So what are they? They're the hierarchy, the toolbar, the 3D view, the property panel, and the asset browser. Now, a lot of people make the mistake of thinking of like, this is the way that's set up. That's the way it has to be. Those are the sensible defaults about how it always should be every single time. But now we grab, for example, Unreal. It's a little bit different. Hierarchy is now on the right. So we have the property panel, toolbar, 3D view, and the asset browser is now hidden by default in Unreal. You have to like tag it open it up, and then tag it to keep it there. So it's a little bit different. Let's take a look instead at 3ds Max. Again, it's different. Hierarchies now on the left, 3D views now, property panels there, toolbars there. It's a lot thicker. There's more to do with the toolbar. Then, of course, we have Maya, which is a little bit different again. Now we also have a bunch more toolbars on the side. Things are different again. And let's grab, of course, the great new kid on the block, Blender, which does it even differently. Hierarchies back on the right side. Toolbar is spread all over the place. So like things are different every single time for all these editors, right? Like there is no, like people always think about like the singular, amazing, always good, and must-have default. Like if we do that, our tooling will be good. It's not really the case. Like those are sensible defaults, right? So it's like, oh, it's always in those locations. So it's a question of what is shown by default, and are those defaults sensible? But no. They can never be sensible. There is no singular, amazing, always good, and must-have default. Now, a lot of times when I say those things, some engineer will prop up and say kind of, well, you are failing to make a decision and pushing the decision on the user by making them like decide on what needs to be where. This is not always correct. Like instead, allow tools to be shaped by the user. Now, at this point, you're probably thinking one of those things, which is one, yes, I know that. How do I convince my manager? Or two, you're totally wrong. What are you talking about? So let's answer both of those questions in one go. And to do that, we have to talk about the end of average. This is a great book by Todd Rose from 2016. I highly recommend reading it. So in there is a story about in the 1940s, the US Air Force, pilots were having trouble. They were like swerving, crashing, all kinds of issues. So what was, of course, brought up as the initial issue that must be the case? Pilot error. The user must be wrong, right? But there were no mechanical or electronic failures, and they go through lots of training, so that can't be the problem. So what did they find out? It was the design of the cockpit. It was made for measurements from 1926. They measured a whole bunch of pilots and averaged those down and went, cool, that's the average cockpit. Everyone's going to fit in there. Great. So what did someone decide? Well, let's measure them again. It's 1926, long time ago. Let's measure them again. Great. So they measured thousands of pilots. And who fit the average? Like if you measured all those people and average it down, is there someone who fits exactly that average? None. None of them do. So if, for example, we take a bunch of body parts here, right, like head, shoulders, chest, arms, waist, legs, and feet, and the size either less or more. Let's say pilot 1 might have a smaller head, smaller shoulders, smaller chest, but larger arms, smaller waist, longer legs, but smaller feet. And then pilot 2, well, they might have a bigger head, bigger shoulders, and a bigger chest, but smaller arms, a bigger waist, smaller legs, and bigger feet. So what's the average pilot? It's this one. And so all the controls were set for that average. And so some people have trouble reaching those and working with those. So pilot 1 is going to be unhappy in these parts, and pilot 2 is going to be unhappy in these parts. So that doesn't really work out well. Now I know what you're going to say. You're going to say oh, well, this is like an exact split. This is a mirror. Of course, it doesn't work out well. But it doesn't really matter how much we measure this. If we move these measurements around and grab their averages, we still have issues. Both pilots are still going to be uncomfortable with that tool set that they are given, right? Pilot 1 still has issues, and Pilot 2 still has issues. So there's no such thing as an average pilot. That's what they found out. And if it's designed for the average, it really means it's fit for nobody. So what was the thing that they had to do here? Well, they had to make it adjustable. Adjust the seat for leg length, adjust controls for the arm length. And they did that. It took a lot of time and effort. Initially, the people who made the cockpits didn't want to do this because it would cost extra money, but they had to do it, US government and all that. Pilot performance soared. It went really, really well. People had a much better time doing these things. So if you let the cockpit adjust to the pilot, that it doesn't matter for them what that cockpit looks like initially. They can set it to be perfect for them, or they can set it to be perfect for them. So there's no such thing as a sensible default. Like, no default can please everyone. Having the defaults be rigid here is the problem. Like, if you need to have a default, can't beat that. There has to be something. But don't say, this is the sensible one and we're good. No, make it adjustable. Having the defaults be rigid is the problem. And your users can know what they need. I know there's a lot of cases it's like, well, you have to decide some things for users. Yes, in some cases you do. But if we're talking about professionals using game development tools, like people who work for like 4, 5, 6 years straight on a AAA project continually, if you ask them what they need, they'll be pretty clear about what it is that they need. You can listen to that and then find out what those issues are underneath. They're professionals. They know what they're doing. Now, at this point, you're probably thinking, sure, but I'm not a pilot. I'm a game developer. Except for a rare few of you. Some of you are pilots. But to go with this, we're game developers. All right, so what is something that you adjust in your space? Your physical space and your digital space. So let's go through that. Let's start off with the physical space, right? So what do you adjust in your physical space? Your chair. How high is it? Where are the armrests? How far does the back go? How far is it from the desk? Is it soft or hard? Does it roll or not? When you initially got that chair and you set it up, you sat down in it, you were uncomfortable. That's fine. You have a couple of levers and you set it so you were comfortable and you never touched it again. But that initial setup was so important because otherwise you'd be having back problems all the time. So it's really important to still do that. Like, if someone gets one of those chairs and would you really kind of say oh, you're failing to make a decision and pushing the decision on the user? No, that chair is adjustable. That's a good thing. So what else do you adjust? Of course, your desk. How high is it? You got electric ones now. It's wonderful. What else? Your screen. How bright is it? Do you have a landscape or do you have it horizontal? How does that work for you? What is comfortable for you to have? And your keyboard. Some of you love having a numpad section. Some of you are like, no, I don't want that. I just want this thing. And there's also some who have those keyboards with the things where you have to grip into them and stuff like that. And apparently it's great for them. But isn't it lovely that they have that choice, that they can work well with their environment? They've adjusted their cockpit. And of course, your mouse. Some of you have one of those MMO mouses, right, with the 20 buttons on it. I can't do that, but some of you are great with those, and that's lovely, right? That's great. Yet you can't adjust your tools. Isn't that weird? All this adjustment that you can do, but in tooling, it's often so difficult to get any kind of adjustment happening. So, thinking about back to the human being, what are you adjusting? Your chair, your screen, your desk, your keyboard, your mouse. What is the core thing that's with all of these? It's you. You are unique. You're a little bit different than everyone else. In fact, your job is probably unique, and there's many factors involved. For example, your studio, your country, your manager, your tools, your culture, your skills. Let's instead look at a level designer. What kind of level designer are you? Level designer 1 might not use a lot of geometry tooling and maybe not a lot of materials, but they might do a lot of narrative work. There's a lot of level designers I know who love doing narrative work. You might not use a lot of combat tooling, but you use a lot of 3D art. You love making lovely looking spaces that have great narratives in them. And you might not do a lot of lighting, and you might not do a lot of scripting. Well, of course, there's level designer 2 who's doing the complete opposite. They're doing a lot of geometry work, a lot of material work, and they love doing that. And they don't do a lot of narrative work, but they do a lot of combat work. Not a lot of 3D art, but a lot of lighting and a lot of scripting. So the average level designer here, of course, is the same as what we saw earlier with the cockpit. It's this one. It doesn't exist. There is no average level designer. You can't make your tool for the average level designer. You have to figure out what level designers do you have, what do they need, and how can we make it so that what they need to do is done in a good way. So there's no sensible default. Don't think about it as, sensible. There's a default. There always is, but averaging out can be disastrous. Like if you pick everything that's out there and just average it down and just kind of go, this is what you need, it's not going to work out well. So don't think of them as sensible defaults. Instead, think of them as editable defaults. Like what can I edit about this default? I've given this default to the user. If they don't like it, if they want to change something about it, how do they do that and to what can they change it? What other options are there? So let's take a look at the digital space instead, right? So let's take a look at a couple of editors again. So in this case, here's Unity, right? So in this case, I can turn all these toolbars on and off, and I can also, like drag them around if I wanted to. I can put them into another location. And they even snap to these sections, and you see that in blue. You can see like, oh, it's going to snap over there. And I can also move these around. I can do things with this interface, right? I can also move these panels around. You might even be thinking about that much when you're doing these things, but this is editing your workspace, right? Like just as you edit your physical space with your chair and your desk, you are also editing the digital space. And so even, for example, if I go into the keyboard section here about the shortcuts, I can adjust these shortcuts. If I want to do something in a different way, if I use Maya a lot, so I like these shortcuts, or I use Blender a lot, so I like use these shortcuts, you can change that. And look how nice and visual that is. Like you can instantly see, oh, these are the buttons that are being used, and these are the buttons that are not being used, and what they're being used with. Now instead, let's take a look at Unreal, right? So I have these toolbars over here, but for example, I could turn on like this FPS counter. That's all nice and great, but I can't like drag this off. Like I can't like move it instantly, right? I can turn off like the whole toolbar. That's possible. But now I can no longer turn off the FPS counter because the whole toolbar's gone, but the FPS counter is still on. So if I turn it back on again, there's like a bunch of things I can do here still, though. Like there's a couple of things that are really nice, which is like, for example, you can drag around this window and you can see where it will snap before it snaps. Isn't that lovely? You've probably had that thing where you snap the window, suddenly everything's broken. In Unreal, much easier, much simpler to see. Like you're going to see what's going to happen and what you place where. Especially think about having 2 or 3 screens. This becomes very, very important. But I can't drag any of these things off. Like I can't like say like, oh, I want this toolbar with these functions. Like just to drag this thing over here, and these are the things that I use often. Sadly, can't do that. It's a bit of a shame. So, but it's those kinds of things, those kinds of editing that can be really, really powerful. And if we then go into the preferences, and for example, take the keyboard shortcuts, it is a giant list. It's just a really big list. And you just have to scroll through it, look at that tiny, tiny scroll bar. How can you find anything, right? Like it's adjustable. Gotta hand them that. It's adjustable. But is it adjustable in a nice, easy way? Not as much, right? And the really cool thing is Keynote, that I made this presentation in, you just right-click the toolbar, and here's all the options for your toolbar. Oh, you want to use this often? Great. Drag and drop it on. Cool. You want to not use something anymore? Drag it off. Oh, you want to set it back to the default? That's totally possible too. If you like want to go back to default because that's easy to use, drag this bottom one up, and boom, you're back to the default. Isn't that so much nice and easier to work in this way? Now, of course, I did work at Apple, but I did not work on this, so I want to take credit for it. It's really, really cool. I did not build this. And another thing over here, for example, is in Blender, right? So in Blender, we have a lot of workspaces is what they call them. So each workspace has its own setup and its own kind of way of working for a specific asset. It's pretty neat, but again, I can't quite like drag things off and like easily put them in a toolbar to like easily work with. Sadly, that's not the case. But what I can do is I can pick some of these options and put them in a quick menu over here. So this quick favorites menu, use it with Q, highly recommend. I go through these things over here and just like right-click on them, add to quick menu. Right-click, add to quick menu. Even here, the toolbar on the left, right-click, add to quick menu. Open a quick menu, there's the options. So if I want to make my own quick use like UI of like these are the things I often use because this is the way that I work, this is the way that I am making content, you can do that in Blender. That's really nice and powerful. But then when it comes to the shortcuts, is not that great still because their documentation only shows the Blender hotkeys. So if you changed your hotkeys to like the industry standard ones that they've included, which I'm very happy about, you can't find that in the documentation. In the documentation, you only see the Blender hotkeys. So it's not, it's a shame. I wish there was like a button to change that in the documentation. You'd be like, oh, I want to see the other hotkeys. Another one, of course, is Maya. The Maya shelves, right? So you have a lot of these options, a lot of different shelves with different options and different things that you can do, right? So depending on what kind of workflow you're currently doing, you can pick the shelf that you want and pick the options that you often pick. But I can also just make a brand new one, empty shelf. I go through the options and I shift click and I can add them to the toolbar. any of these options, they have hotkeys. They are in a menu somewhere. I simply shift-click, and I just keep adding them to a toolbar. So I can create my own toolbar in my own way for the work that I need to do as a user, right? And the funny thing is like, if you work in AAA, you probably have one. Like, you have a Maya shelf. I know because when I visit studios, I see this a lot. Because it was made by a tech artist 15 years ago. It's been shared with everyone else in the studio, especially tech artists. Like, everyone has to use this because it's so awesome. So like every artist uses this. It's recommended to everyone who is hired. Like, you're brought on, they're like, here's the Maya shelf, use this one. All the stuff is in there. You don't have to look for anything, just that's the stuff. So it's critical for the pipeline. If any of this breaks, if that Maya shelf or any of the tooling on it breaks, everyone's in trouble. And you know what? That tech artist doesn't even work there anymore. Like, the person who made that, they're long gone. But you're still using it. I know these exist all over the place. And that shows this power, right, of like setting up your own toolbar, setting up the tooling in a way that works well for your users. And of course, toolbars are not the main subject in tool UX design. They're just a nice example that I can grab now because it's easy to make videos of them and easy and simple to explain them. But really the core thing here is that adjusting to your needs is key. You're going to be working this tool for 8+ hours a day for 4 years. That's a very, very long time. So what is on the toolbar? What is in the drop-downs? Which panels are visible? Do I have workspaces? Are my workflows clear? And is what I need where I need it? There are defaults, but can the user adjust these to make it even simpler and even nicer to work with? And a really important part as well with this is to don't think per tool, instead think per workflow. For example, what do you need to block out a combat area? We might say, for example, that we need geometry tooling, materials, narrative tooling, combat tooling, 3D art, lighting, and scripting tooling, right? Like, these are all various tools. But I often see them being built on their own. Like, oh, this is the scripting tool, and this is the material tool, and this is the geometry tool. But if you look at a workflow like blocking out a combat area, what are the workflow needs? Well, there's a lot of geometry work, sure, not a lot of materials, not a lot of narrative, a lot of combat, not a lot of 3D art, a little bit of lighting to show the way where the player needs to go, right? Doesn't have to look beautiful yet. And a bunch of scripting to make the combat area work. Great. So now you've done that work. Now, what if I want to polish this combat area? Because now we're done with it, I got to move on to the next step, right? Like, there's always next steps, we're always constantly building. All of this changes. Now you need much less geometry tooling, but much more material tooling. Still not a lot of narrative, but a little bit of combat, a lot of 3D art, and a lot of lighting, right? So even with the same area, the user has to adjust to what they are currently building. Now, of course, a creative director at this point will come in, and they will say, oh, we need a friendly NPC in that area as well. There's going to be a whole thing, and there's a narrative thing going on. And okay, what if a friendly NPC gets added after combat? Again, things change a lot. Now we need a lot of geometry tooling again because the NPC can't get stuck. They get stuck a lot. It happens. Not need a lot of material tooling. We do need a lot of narrative tooling, a little bit less combat, a little 3D art, not a lot of lighting, and a bunch of scripting. So even in one area here, we've worked on 3 separate sections. We've worked on that section 3 times. We've done things to it, and it adjusted what kind of tooling we were using. We were not using these tools individually. We were using them together with other things. We were working within a workflow. So don't think per tool, think per workflow. Like, don't think about the geometry tool and the shader graph and the scripting tool and the terrain tool and the lighting tools and the dialogue tool as all these separate things that are separately used by separate people. Most of the time, they're not. Instead, within your editors, they blend together. And they form sections in which people do different things. Like, this might be that combat workflow. This might be that narrative workflow. This might be the cinematics workflow, where you're using these specific tools. And this might be the grayboxing workflow, where you're using these specific tools. So what are solutions to this? Like, what can we do? Well, of course, the most important thing, as I mentioned, is make the defaults adjustable. You're going to have defaults. Make sure you can adjust them. And allow users to set up their own workflows. Like, if they are professionals, if they're working in your company for many, many years, either in AAA or in indie, let them adjust these things so they can easily work with them. Like, allow your users to be creative. They often know very well what they need. And look at what other tools allow to be adjusted. Like, we saw a whole bunch of tooling just now, for example, in the Maya cell specifically, where it's so simple and easy to set that up. There's no ini files, there's no scripting, there's no, like, just shift-click, and it appears in the way that you want to. So don't force your users into uncomfortable workflows either. Like, it happens a lot, right? Especially when people get used to those workflows. they just kind of like stick with them, and it's very painful and it sucks, but they're like, well, there's nothing I can do. I guess I just got to deal with this. And that causes burnout and a whole bunch of people being unhappy and just less creativity. Like, it's a bad, bad vibe to be in. So don't think of defaults as sensible. But of course, often the argument that I hear at that point is like, well, if I can access everything I need all the time, doesn't that mean I have a very busy and complex interface? Like, wouldn't there be buttons everywhere? Because if I constantly want to touch what I want to touch. So let's take a look at one, for example, like here in Blender. There's a lot going on. Is it bad, though? Like, is it bad that there's so many things going on? If you're a professional who knows well how this works, I bet you're going to have a great time with this. As a new user, you're going to open this up and go, whoa, what do I do? And that's fair. For an initial user, it might not be this busy. But when you duly know well what you're doing and everything is what you need in the place that you need it because it was adjustable, at that point, it doesn't become much of a problem. And a big thing we saw that with, for example, is Unreal 4 used to look like this, right? Unreal looked like this in Unreal 4 with a bunch of buttons all over the place. And in Unreal 5, they've changed that. Now it looks like this. We have much less buttons. And the asset browser is now on the bottom, like you have to open it up and tag it, right? And I would say that for new users, this is an improvement, right? Like, you open it up, there's much less going on. But you can't then easily adjust things to have a bunch of buttons that you did use often to have them in the place where you want it to be in, right? You have to go through ini files and a whole bunch of other stuff to make that happen, or blueprint scripting and a whole bunch of stuff. While we've seen just now in Maya and Keynote, right-click and drag, or just shift-click and add them to a thing. There's engineering difficulty in that, making that happen, of course. None of these things are free. But thinking about, again, 8 hours a day for 4 years with a whole bunch of people working on this thing, if you can give them a slight bit of efficiency improvement, a lot's going to happen with that over a 4-year period. Now, of course, when this complexity kind of happens, a lot of people still kind of go like, oh, this is too much. It's a cockpit view. There's a lot going on. So, of course, to talk about that, we have to go back to airplanes again. So the comparison often is like, it looks like a cockpit, right? Like, there's buttons everywhere. It's overwhelming. How do you know what to do? How do you know what to touch? And I agree. Like, if I'm put in the cockpit of an airplane while it's flying, I'm not going to be able to land it. It's going to be a problem. And that's probably okay. Like, I haven't learned how to use that, right? But with a professional doing this, they do know how to make that right. Like, they do know how to fly that. So each single button, screen, and section is there for a reason and has a particular purpose. It's a highly professional tool and a professional environment to work in. When you start out, you have no idea what you're doing. You'll be in a simulator instead. You'll go hours and hours of training. And that's fine, because afterwards, you have this really big, complex machine that you can do cool things with. So to take this analogy one step further, even if you're switching for, like, for example, an Airbus to a Boeing jet, there's a big change. Those buttons are entirely different. You have to do a whole bunch of training just to go from one to the other, right? They can't just make that switch. There's a lot going on there. And yet, when we're making games, that's expected of us. Like, you're working in Unity, right? And you're making a bunch of things in Blender. And there's also Miro. There's a bunch of documentation that you're working with. And there's also Jira, which is also an entirely different interface. And then there's Confluence, which is where the documentation is. And maybe you're using ShotGrid as well. And also, like, looking at all these assets. And you're just asked to just switch between all of these constantly. Like, that's confusing, right? It's like switching from Airbus to a Boeing. It's confusing. It's difficult. You're constantly having to adjust. Like, if you haven't looked at Jiras in a while, a lot of people have, if you suddenly have to switch back to Jira, you're going to be like, oh, where was that one thing again? Think instead, like, what if that UI was set up by you to make it easy? Like, oh, yeah, I want this thing over here, this thing over here, this thing over here. So I know that when I switch from our editor to Jira, it looks similar-ish. I have an idea of where to look. Think about how much gain that gives. So cockpits are not necessarily bad. Like, if you're putting a brand new user in there, yeah, they're going to crash. But if your user can effectively work with them, then it's not as bad. Of course, you want to make everything nice and simple, but sometimes for a professional, you need to give them 30 buttons because they're going to be pressing them entirely correctly, like a piano. Has a lot of buttons, but if someone knows what to do well, something amazing is going to come out of it. So if they fit their exact needs, if they can find everything, if the tools are adjustable, if they can make their own workflow, if the visualization is for them, like, if they can work well and accomplish their tasks, that's in the end the goal, right? In the end, of the goal of the tooling is not for there to be cool tooling. It's for something to be made with that will then be released. And that product needs to be incredible, right? So we need to make sure the tooling works well to make that product. So there's no such thing as a sensible default. No sensible defaults. Think about editable defaults. Now, to go back to the quote in the beginning, you are failing to make a decision and pushing it on the user. I said this is not always correct. And the reason for this is actually, the original quote's much different. Much, much different. The original quote is, every time you provide an option, you're asking the user to make a decision. That means they will have to think about something and decide about it. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but in general, you should always try to minimize the number of decisions that people have to make. So by Joel Spolsky. So on his blog, I highly recommend reading it. Like, it's great. So it's a very different kind of thing. It's not like, oh, you're forcing decisions on the user. It's like, sometimes adjusting is good, but don't constantly have pop-ups all over the place to kind of go, oh, you this, that. That's, of course, a bad thing. And there's also, it's important to know, there's a difference between basic UX and complex UX. You can also find this on the Nielsen-Norman website about UX, where it's like, if you're making a simple app, it's very different from a giant tool, right? Like, if you read the basic UX books and it's like, oh, how to build a website in a good way, that's good. There's good stuff in there that is usable, but you can't like directly apply that to tooling a lot of the time because it's a different kind of vibe. Like, a basic flight booking app is different from a complex game development tool. So a flight booking app is used a few times in short bursts, right? Like, I need to book a flight. This is what I need to do. So the goal of the booking app is incredibly clear. I want to fly from here to here on this date. I know what I'm going to do before I even open up the app. So if it needs to facilitate a few very particular needs, right? Like, it needs to do those tasks incredibly well, but it's just those. And we know exactly what's going to happen. On the other hand, a tool is used 8+ hours a day for 4+ years. And the goal of the tool is creativity, which is unbounded, changes, and is uncertain. Like, constantly there will be changes. There'll be meetings, there'll be documentation. This level has to change, this NPC has to change. You're constantly changing things. When you're opening up the editor at the beginning of the day, you might think, oh, I'm going to build this level. And in the middle of it, you're like, this does not play well. I got to adjust it. So it is not a clear thing that you're doing every single time with these tools. It changes constantly. So it needs to facilitate a huge amount of widely ranging needs. It's a different kind of UX. Of course, the basics like, oh, green is good, red is bad, yellow is warning. Those simple UX things are largely still the same, but there is a difference here in whether you're making a very complex professional tool or a simple tool that does one particular thing. If you want to know more about that, please read Interaction Design for Complex Problem Solving by Barbara Merrill. It was released in 2006, I think. It's not a really well-known book, but like, it goes into these things where it's like, it's very important to think about how you make interaction design like for complex problem solving. Not simple things, but complex things, because making games is very, very complex. And of course, I'd be remiss not to mention also designing the user experience of game development tools. I love that title. It's very on the nose. You instantly get what it's about. By David Lightbound. I'd also highly recommend reading that one. So, removing defaults of sensible defaults, what does that mean? It means defaults are necessary, but don't think of them as sensible. And treat defaults as temporary and don't rely on them always being the same. We saw that with Blender, where they always think in the documentation like, oh, you must be using the Blender hotkeys. What if someone isn't? Suddenly they're in trouble, right? So don't always think like, oh, it's always going to be like this for every user. And give users the power to easily edit defaults, right? Like, plenty of editors allow editing for defaults, but in complex, difficult ways. Like, to the point where sometimes people kind of go, oh, you open up Visual Studio and you do the thing over here. It's like, for artists especially non-technical artists, you're asking the world of them. Shift-click, click and drag. It can be simple. And look at what other tools and editors can adjust. Like, we saw that thing, for example, in Unity, right, where it's super easy to see these are the hotkeys being used. This is what I want to adjust. I can search for them easily. And then on Unreal, it's a giant list. That's a complication, right? They're both editable. You can definitely say, if you finish that task, you can tag it as done in Jira. They're editable. But is one as easily editable or nicely editable as it potentially should be for the users that you have? If you have amazing artists working on Unreal setting up levels, you want to make it easy for them to also adjust those things if they often switch between Maya and Unreal or Blender and Unreal to set the hotkeys for what they want to use. And also, think about your prioritization metrics, right? Like, if the thing is done, doesn't always mean that it's easily usable. Like, think about those things. Like, what is the prioritization that we're setting to this? Like, if it's doable but I have to jump through 5 hoops, is that really as good as we can get it to be? And think back to that human being, right? Think back to yourself. If you're sitting in that chair and you didn't adjust that chair, you'd be uncomfortable. If you have a keyboard in a way that doesn't fit well for you, you're going to cramp up and not be able to work anymore. If you can't adjust your desk or adjust your screen to work in a way that works well for you, you're going to have trouble. So if you're having trouble with that, why wouldn't someone else have trouble with the tooling if they can't adjust those things? Thank you very much.